Hello and welcome to the Offer versus Serve training for breakfast and lunch. In this session, we will begin by defining offer versus serve. Then we will go through a quick review of the meal components and patterns for breakfast and lunch. And once we have that background knowledge, we will learn how to implement offer versus serve at breakfast and lunch. And finally, we will use our knowledge about offer versus serve and practice identifying reimbursable meals. Let's start by defining offer versus serve, or OVS as it is sometimes referred to. Offer versus serve is a provision in the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program that allows students to decline some of the food offered. Offer versus serve is not required in all instances. Offer versus serve is not required for breakfast for any grade level or for lunch for grades K through 8. However, offer versus serve is required for lunch for grades 9 through 12. For schools that do choose to implement offer versus serve, generally speaking, the way it works is that the school first plans and offers a reimbursable meal. Then, the students come through the serving line and select the required food components or items. And lastly, at the end of the serving line or after the serving line, the cashier confirms that the meal is reimbursable and then records that meal. Before we move on, I want to emphasize the first two statements on the previous slide to highlight the difference between planned and served. For any meal service option, the menus always have to be planned so that they make up a reimbursable meal. All components in the required minimum portion sizes must be available to all students. But with offer versus serve, students don't have to select all items in the minimum portion sizes. They have choices. More often than not, what a student actually selects for their meal will not be the same as what was planned. We will go through more examples later in the session, but let's take a quick moment to look at the difference between what's planned and what the student actually selects. So we have a planned menu here with several choices: a deli sub or cheese pizza, an assortment of fruits and vegetables, and a variety of milk. Students can only choose one entree, but they can choose from any or all of the other items on the menu. In this scenario, the student chooses to select the deli sub, orange slices in a half-cup portion size, and kiwi in a fourth-cup portion size. Notice that the kiwi selected is not the minimum portion size as planned. The student only chose to select a fourth of a cup rather than a half cup. This meal is reimbursable, even though the student has not selected the entire menu but has made choices as to what they would like to eat. Being able to recognize the difference between planned menus and what the student actually selects is the key to understanding offer versus serve. In contrast to what we just talked about, giving students choices and options, if a school chooses not to implement offer versus serve, students are not able to decline any of the foods offered. For example, if a school is not utilizing offer versus serve, students can't decline the milk. They must select milk in order for the meal to be counted as reimbursable. So, if offer versus serve isn't required, why implement it? Because offer versus serve increases customer satisfaction since students are not required to take meal components they don't plan to eat. Theoretically, students will throw less food away since they are not required to take as many items and items they don't plan to eat. Another reason to utilize offer versus serve is because it helps control food costs because production can be modified to account for student preferences. For example, if you usually serve 100 students and green peas are on the menu, you may know from past experience that only 50 of the students will choose the peas, so you only need to prepare 50 rather than 100 servings of the peas. Now that we know what offer versus serve is and why it's beneficial to implement it, let's talk about offer versus serve at breakfast. There are 3 required food components for breakfast: milk, grain, and fruit. All menus must be planned to include all required food components in the minimum required portion sizes, which we will look at a little more closely in a couple minutes. Enough food must be offered so that each child could take the full planned amount of every component if they choose. And when there is a variety of menu options or multiple serving lines, each meal option or serving line must offer all required food components. Let's take just a couple minutes to review the meal pattern requirements for breakfast. The slides that follow show the minimum daily and weekly requirements for each food component. When talking about offer versus serve, though, we will be paying special attention to the daily meal pattern requirements rather than the weekly requirements. Not that the weekly requirements aren't important, it's just that when talking about offer versus serve, we're more concerned with daily menus and most concerned with meals at the point of service. Weekly meal pattern requirements are covered in detail in a different session, so at this point I'm going to breeze through the next few slides. For fruits, students in grades K through 12 must be offered at least 1 cup daily at breakfast. This may include fresh, frozen, or canned fruit, or dried fruit. Canned fruit must be in water, juice, or light syrup, and no more than half of the weekly fruit amount offered may be in the form of 100% juice. At breakfast, vegetables may be substituted for fruits. If offering vegetables at breakfast, you must offer at least 2 cups of vegetables from the dark green, red, orange, beans, peas, or other subgroup over the course of the week before you can count starchy vegetables such as potatoes as a creditable vegetable. For grains, students in grades K through 12 must be offered 1 ounce equivalent of grain daily at breakfast. After offering the daily minimum of 1 ounce equivalent of grain, you may offer and credit meat alternates as grains. For milk, all students must be offered at least 2 types of fluid milk each day in an 8-ounce portion. This requirement also applies if breakfast is served in the classroom. The milk offered must be fat-free plain, fat-free flavored, or low-fat plain. Let's discuss a few details related to offer versus serve at breakfast. As I mentioned before, offer versus serve is optional at breakfast for all grades. 4 food items from the 3 food components, fruit, vegetable, grain, and milk, must be offered in order for the menu to be reimbursable. The menu planner can decide the portion sizes, and from the 4 items offered, students must select at least 3 items. Students must select at least half a cup of fruit or vegetable plus 2 other food items for the meal to be counted and claimed for reimbursement. Students must be allowed to select all 4 items. When talking about breakfast, there are a couple definitions that we need to cover. We need to make a distinction between a food component and a food item. A food component is a category of food that must be offered at breakfast. As we've already discussed, there are 3 food components: fruit or vegetable, milk, and grain. A food item is a food or combination of foods that may be offered within the 3 food components. 4 food items from the 3 food components must be offered for offer versus serve to be implemented properly. Larger portions of grain items may count as more than 1 food item. For example, a 2-ounce equivalent muffin can count as 1 or 2 food items. It's up to the menu planner to decide how the muffin will credit. Here are the possible breakfast menu combinations, which include the 4 required food items. At the top left, we have a menu that includes a fruit, a milk, a grain, and a grain. At the top right, we have a menu that includes a fruit, a juice, crediting as a fruit, a milk, and a grain. And at the bottom, or the center, we have a menu that includes fruit, milk, grain, and a meat alternate, counting as a grain. And note, you can always offer more than 4 food items if you would like. So now let's talk about a few offer versus serve fruit and vegetable details. For menu planning, 1 cup of fruit may be offered as more than 1 food item. And in order for a meal to be reimbursable, all students must have at least a half cup of fruit or vegetable, or a combination of the two, plus 2 other food items on their tray. Here are some examples of offering the 1 cup of fruit requirement as 2 different food items. On the left side, we have a half cup of grapes and a half cup of orange juice. And on the right side, we have a banana, counting as a half a cup, and a half cup of strawberries. Now let's talk about a few offer versus serve grain details. A 1 ounce equivalent grain counts as 1 food item. Meat alternates may count as grains if 1 ounce equivalent of grain was also offered. And larger portion grain items may count as more than 1 food item. For example, a 4 ounce muffin, which credits as 2 ounce equivalents of grain, may count as 1 or 2 food items. Here are a couple examples of substituting meat alternate for grain. Both of these options would credit as 2 ounce equivalents of grain. On the left, we have a piece of whole grain toast and a hard-boiled egg. And on the right, we have granola and yogurt. Now let's put into practice what we've just learned by identifying reimbursable breakfast meals and menus. Here's a breakfast menu that includes a muffin, fresh fruit, fruit juice, and milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? Yes. The menu offers at least 4 food items and 1 full cup of fruit. So from that menu we just looked at, let's say a student selects the muffin, an apple, and milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? Yes. The student selected at least a half a cup of fruit plus 2 other items, the muffin and the milk. Here's another meal that a student selects, a muffin and a milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? No. The student did not select the required half cup of fruit, so this is not a reimbursable meal. Let's look at another menu. Here we have a couple of options, so the students are able to select 1 or 2 items from a variety of grain and meat alternate items. They also are able to select a cup of peaches and a variety of milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? Yes. The menu offers 1 cup of fruit, 1 cup of milk, plus at least 1 ounce equivalent of grain and an additional item, for a total of 4 items. So let's say a student selects this meal: string cheese, cereal, and milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? No, this is not reimbursable because the student did not select the required half cup of fruit or vegetable. Here's another menu: an egg omelet, fresh grapes and juice, half cup each, and 1 cup of milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? No, this menu is missing a full component, the grain. Even though meat alternates can credit as a grain at breakfast, the menu must first offer an actual grain item each day, and then meat alternates can count as grains. So then let's take a look at this menu. Is this a reimbursable menu? Yes, it is. It's the same menu we were just looking at, but this time the menu planner has planned a piece of toast as well. So then this would be a reimbursable menu because it includes a grain. Here's another menu. Is this reimbursable? We have a muffin, half cup of fruit with the orange, and 1 cup of milk. No, this menu falls short of the fruit requirement because the meal pattern requires 1 cup of fruit and the orange only provides a half cup. Now let's transition to lunch. When talking about offer versus serve at lunch, there are a couple points to keep in mind. At lunch, there are 5 required food components: milk, grain, meat alternate, fruits, and vegetables. All menus must be planned to include all the required food components in the minimum required portion sizes, which we will look at a little more closely in a minute. Enough food must be offered so that each child could take the full planned amount of every component if they choose, and when there is a variety of menu options or multiple serving lines, each meal option or serving line must offer all required food components. Let's look at the meal pattern requirements for lunch in a little more detail. The slides that follow show the minimum daily and weekly requirements for each food component. I mentioned earlier in the breakfast section that when talking about offer versus serve, we will be paying special attention to the daily meal pattern requirements rather than the weekly requirements. This holds true for lunch as well. It's not that the weekly requirements aren't important, it's just that when talking about offer versus serve, we're more concerned with daily menus and most concerned with what's on the student's tray at the point of service. For the meat alternate component, students in grades K through 8 must be offered at least 1 ounce equivalent each day, and students in grades 9 through 12 must be offered at least 2 ounce equivalents each day. For the fruit component, students in grades K through 8 must be offered at least half cup each day, and students in grades 9 through 12 must be offered at least 1 cup each day. For vegetables, students in grades K through 8 must be offered at least 3/4 of a cup each day, and students in grades 9 through 12 must be offered at least 1 cup each day. The weekly vegetable subgroup requirements are not listed on the slide, and I'm not going to cover those because offer versus serve applies to what students actually select and put on their tray rather than what has been planned over the course of the week. At the point of service, we aren't really concerned with the types of vegetables the students select, but rather the total amount of vegetables. For grains, students in grades K through 8 must be offered 1 ounce equivalent of grain each day, and students in grades 9 through 12 must be offered 2 ounce equivalents of grain each day. And for milk, all students must be offered at least 2 types of fluid milk each day in an 8 ounce portion. The milk types offered must be fat-free plain, fat-free flavored, or low-fat plain. Let's discuss a few details related to offer versus serve at lunch. Offer versus serve is required for grades 9 through 12 only. It is optional for grades K through 8. All 5 food components in the required minimum portion sizes must be offered each day, and the menu planner can decide portion sizes for different items. Students have the option to decline 2 components if they want to, which means they must select 3 components. One of the components must be at least a half a cup of fruit or vegetable or a combination of the two, and the other 2 components that the student selects must be in the minimum required portion size. Let's talk a little bit more about fruits and vegetables. For lunch to be reimbursable, students in all grades must select at least a half cup of fruit or vegetable or a combination of the two, and this is the same as at breakfast. Let's look at an example of offer versus serve related specifically to fruits and vegetables. Sometimes a student will select a fruit and vegetable as 2 of the 3 required components. This can certainly contribute to a reimbursable meal at the point of service as long as the student selects a half a cup of fruit or vegetable or a combination and selects the second fruit or vegetable in the minimum required portion size for that grade group. So for example, students in grades K through 8 must select a half a cup of fruit and a half a cup of vegetable plus 1 other full component, and students in grades 9 through 12 must select a half a cup of 1 fruit or vegetable and then 1 cup of the other, plus 1 other full component. Now a couple offer versus serve meat alternate and grain details. If a student selects a meat alternate or a grain item and you want to count it as one of the 3 meal components, the student must select the minimum portion size required by the meal pattern. For grades K through 8, that means students must select at least 1 ounce equivalent, and for grades 9 through 12, that means students must select at least 2 ounce equivalents. For example, if the menu planner offers the meat alternate component as 2 food items, so for example a cheese stick and chicken nuggets, to students in grades K through 8 and the minimum portion size for this grade group is 1 ounce equivalent, the student may select either the cheese stick or the chicken nuggets to count as the meat alternate component. However, if the same 2 items are offered to students in grades 9 through 12, where the minimum portion size is 2 ounce equivalents, the student must select both the cheese stick and chicken nuggets to count as the meat alternate component. And this example would work the same way for the grain component. So now let's do what we did with breakfast, but this time we'll put into practice what we've just learned by identifying reimbursable lunch meals and menus. Let's start with a menu for grades K through 5. This menu offers 2 tacos which provide 2 ounce meat alternate and 2 ounce equivalent of grain, 1/4 of a cup of refried beans, 1 cup of shredded lettuce which credits as a 1/2 cup of vegetable, oranges in a 1/2 cup portion, a 1/2 cup apple slices, and 1 cup of milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? Yes, it includes the required components in the correct portion sizes. At least a 1/2 cup of fruit, 3/4 of a cup of vegetable, at least 1 ounce of meat alternate and grains, and 1 cup of milk. So from the menu we just looked at, let's say that Emily chooses 2 tacos, the refried beans, and the shredded lettuce. Is this a reimbursable meal? Yes. Emily has selected at least a 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable with the lettuce and the beans, plus 2 other full components, grain and meat. A note here, the menu planner has planned a 2 ounce equivalent of grain and a 2 ounce equivalent of meat alternate portion, but the minimum required for grades K through 5 is only 1 ounce of each. So really, Emily could have selected just 1 taco and it still would have been a reimbursable meal because it would have contained a 1/2 cup of vegetable plus 1 ounce of meat and 1 ounce of grain. So let's say that Ethan chooses 2 tacos and 1 cup of milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? No. Although Ethan has 3 components, he did not select at least a 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable. So let's say that Ryan selected a 1/4 a cup of the refried beans, 1/2 a cup of apple slices, and 1 cup of milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? No. Although Ryan selected the required 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable, a 1/2 cup of apple slices, he only selected 1 other full component, the milk. He only selected a 1/4 a cup of vegetable, but if he had selected a 1/2 cup of the refried beans, then the beans could count as the required 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable, the 1/2 cup of apple slices would count as a full fruit component, and the milk would count as the 3rd full component. One thing about this example that's kind of interesting and important is that the beans can credit as a vegetable or they can credit as a meat alternate. The important thing to note, though, is that they cannot count as both and they cannot count as either or at the point of service. The menu planner decides how they want to credit the beans, and then they have to make sure and communicate that to staff serving on the line, and most importantly, staff at the point of service who are responsible for identifying reimbursable meals. In this example, the menu planner has decided to offer and credit the refried beans as the vegetable, which is why this meal isn't reimbursable. However, if the menu planner had decided to offer and credit the refried beans as a meat alternate, then this meal would be reimbursable because 1/4 of a cup of beans equals 1 ounce equivalent of meat alternate. Let's look at another menu. This menu is for grades 6 through 8 and includes chicken drummies, which credit as 2 ounce equivalents of meat alternate, 1/4 of a cup of carrots, 1/2 a cup of broccoli, 1/2 a cup of mashed potatoes, 1/2 cup of grapes, and 1 cup of milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? No. This menu is missing a full component, the grain component. In order for a menu to be reimbursable, all 5 components must be offered in the minimum required portion sizes. It's very important to make sure all components are offered, because if the menu as planned is missing a component, then all meals are considered non-reimbursable regardless of what the student selects. So now let's say that instead of the mashed potatoes, we offer brown rice. Would this be reimbursable? Yes, it would be, because now we have added in a grain, so all 5 components in the minimum required portion sizes are offered. So from that menu, let's say that Mike selected the chicken drummies, glazed carrots, and milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? No. Although Mike has selected 3 components, the carrots do not meet the required 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable. If Mike had selected a little bit more carrots to make a 1/2 cup or another fruit or vegetable item, then this would be a reimbursable meal. Let's say that Sam chooses broccoli, brown rice, and grapes. Is this a reimbursable meal? Yes. Sam has selected the required 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable serving with the 1/2 a cup of broccoli, plus 2 other full planned components, 1 ounce equivalent of grain and a 1/2 cup of grapes, because a 1/2 cup is the minimum daily fruit requirement for grades 6 through 8, so that counts as a full component. Now let's look at a menu for grades 9 through 12. This menu offers 2 ounces equivalent of grain with spaghetti, 2 ounces of meat and a 1/2 cup of vegetable with meat sauce, a mixed green salad which offers a 1/2 cup of vegetable because dark leafy greens only credit as 1/2 of the serving size, 1 ounce equivalent of grain with garlic bread, 1 cup of mixed fruit, and 8 ounces of milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? Yes, it offers all 5 components in at least the minimum required serving sizes. So from that menu, let's say Aziza selects the meat sauce, the mixed green salad, and garlic bread. Is this a reimbursable meal? No. Although Aziza took at least a 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable and the full component of meat alternate, she did not take a second full component. The garlic bread doesn't meet the minimum grain requirement for grades 9 through 12, which is 2 ounce equivalents. So Aziza would have to take another ounce equivalent of grain with the spaghetti, or another full component, such as a milk. Then the meal would be reimbursable. So let's look at another menu for grades 9 through 12. This menu offers a turkey sub on whole grain bun, which counts as 2 ounces of meat and 2 ounces of grain, 1/2 a cup of sweet potato fries, 1/2 a cup of fresh veggie sticks, 1/2 a cup of peaches and light syrup, 1 cup of strawberries, and 8 fluid ounces of milk. Is this a reimbursable menu? Yes. All 5 components are offered in at least the minimum required portion sizes for grades 9 through 12. So from that menu, let's say Nicole selects the fresh veggie sticks, peaches, and strawberries. Is this a reimbursable meal? No. Only one full component and the required half cup of fruit and vegetable was taken. The strawberries make up the full fruit component, and the vegetable sticks make up the half cup of fruit or vegetable. A tray of only fruits and vegetables is not reimbursable. There always has to be at least 3 different components, and at least one of which has to be a half cup of fruit or vegetable. So Nicole would need to select milk, grain, or meat in the minimum required portion sizes in order for this meal to be reimbursable. So from the same menu, let's say May selects the turkey sub, fresh veggie sticks, strawberries, and the milk. Is this a reimbursable meal? Yes. May has selected at least a half cup of fruit or vegetable and at least 2 other full components, so this meal is reimbursable. Now that we know the basics and feel comfortable identifying reimbursable meals, let's talk about offer versus serve and meal service type. Let's say you have a grab-and-go service style for breakfast and also want to implement offer versus serve. You may want to pre-plate or bundle some of the food items. USDA does allow schools to bundle 2 or 3 food items if facility, space, or design are a challenge. If bundling, consider other ways to offer choices, like a fruit basket or a variety of milk or variety of bundles. An example of pre-plating or bundling or pre-bagging meals at breakfast would be to prepare bags that contain a grain item and a half cup of fruit, and then have a fruit basket available and milk available for students to select more fruit if they'd like and milk if they'd like. Remember that offer versus serve is never required at breakfast for any grade. However, SFAs are encouraged to remain consistent with the intent of offer versus serve to allow students choice and flexibility, reduce waste, and food costs. If you utilize offer versus serve, there are a couple of tips that would be helpful to know. You must ensure that staff are trained on the basics of offer versus serve requirements for both breakfast and lunch. It's also critical that staff involved in the meal service, so those involved in serving and in determining a reimbursable meal at the end of the line, know the planned menu and the planned portion sizes for each daily food component. The menu planner must therefore communicate planned portions to staff before the meal is served. Think about how you will communicate with your staff at the beginning of the meal service. They will need to know how each food item credits. For example, if a breakfast bread is offered, do staff know how it credits? Or at lunch, if breaded chicken is offered, does the breading count as a 1 ounce equivalent of grain? What if it only credits as 3/4 of an ounce, or is not whole grain rich? Then it cannot be counted as one of the 3 components, and staff at the point of service would need to know that. And if we think back to the meal example we looked at earlier, it's important to let staff know how beans are planned into the menu. Are the beans crediting as a meat alternate or as a vegetable? It's very important for point of service staff to understand how each menu item credits and for how much. Staff at the point of service must be able to recognize a reimbursable meal and accurately judge quantities of food items that are self-served. Communication and staff training are critical components to successfully implementing offer versus serve. The last thing we need to talk about in regards to offer versus serve is meal identification. Meal identification is a meal service requirement if implementing offer versus serve. You're required to identify the foods that are part of the reimbursable meal near or at the beginning of the serving line. This helps ensure students understand the components of the reimbursable meal and do not make unintentional purchase of a la carte foods. Schools have discretion as to how to identify the foods that are part of the reimbursable meal, but at a minimum, a menu, daily or monthly, must be posted as well as a sign at the front of the serving line that indicates that students must select at least a half cup of fruit or vegetable as part of the meal. Here's an example of a reimbursable meal signage. This option has space available to write in the menu or meal components each day, and it includes a statement that students must select a red or a green or a fruit or a vegetable. Here's another example of signage for lunch. It has the same concept as the one that we just looked at, just in a little bit different format. And here's an example of signage for breakfast. It's very similar to the signage for lunch, but it reflects the breakfast meal pattern and component requirements. Offer versus serve can be a challenging concept to master, but the good thing is that there are resources to help. You can look for signage ideas and other resources and tools on the USDA Team Nutrition Best Practices Sharing Center, which I have a screenshot of on the left side of the slide. The offer versus serve guidance is also very helpful, especially for some of those tricky scenarios that you encounter that we weren't able to cover in a training. The link to the memo and guidance can be found on our website, but the direct link is included on this slide. So that completes the offer versus serve presentation. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you learned something new. Please do not hesitate to contact our office if you have any questions. This project has been funded at least in part with federal funds from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The contents of this publication do not necessarily reflect the view or policies of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, nor does mention of trade names, commercial products, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. USDA is an equal opportunity provider and employer.